I still remember the moment like it happened yesterday. The phone rang, and I saw my mom's face twist into something I had never seen before. You could tell something was off, but I never could have guessed it would be about my uncle. My uncle had been arrested. The news hit me like a ton of bricks, and honestly I couldn't process it. I mean, this was my uncle, the guy who taught me to ride a bike, the one who was always the life of the family gatherings, cracking jokes and making everyone feel at home. Arrested. For what? But as the initial shock wore off, I started to notice something strange. My family wasn't exactly acting like they usually did when something big went down. Sure, they were upset, but it was almost like they were hiding something. You know, when people are just a little too careful with their words. That's exactly what was going on. My family had this weird, unspoken tension swirling around, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a deeper story buried beneath the surface. No one was saying it out loud, but you could feel it, the weight of something being covered up. Something bigger than just an arrest. It wasn't just a simple family drama. There was more to it, and I had this gut feeling I wasn't going to like what I was about to uncover. Everyone kept talking about the arrest, but no one was brave enough to say what had really happened. The truth, what was hidden beneath all the surface-level conversations, was something that I didn't even want to consider. But, as with most things, the more you try to ignore it, the more it smacks you in the face. As I dug deeper into what was really going on, the pieces started to fall together. Family loyalty, hidden truths, and unspoken bonds. What was my uncle mixed up in? And why was no one telling me the full story? Every conversation felt like a game of chess, where the truth was this elusive piece that no one wanted to be caught holding. Now, I'm about to take you through the whole journey. The shocking arrest, the cover-up, and the secrets that no one wanted to talk about. Because, trust me, when it comes to family, there's always more to the story. And sometimes, uncovering those secrets is the hardest thing you'll ever do. When I first found out about my uncle's arrest, it felt like someone had dropped a bombshell into the middle of my life. I was sitting at home just chilling when my phone buzzed. It was my mom calling. I answered, expecting the usual check-in, but instead, her voice was shaky. "Your uncle's been arrested," she said. "You won't believe what happened." My mind raced. What could he have possibly done to end up in handcuffs? My uncle wasn't some hardened criminal. He was always the one with a smile on his face, the guy who could light up a room just by walking into it. This just didn't make sense. But it didn't take long for me to realize that my initial shock was just the tip of the iceberg. You see, the arrest wasn't just about a simple mistake or misunderstanding. As I tried to piece together what had actually gone down, the more confused and unsettled I became. There were whispers everywhere. At the dinner table, in the living room, even on the phone. But no one would say it outright. They kept hinting at something, but the truth remained elusive. There was definitely more to this arrest than met the eye, and it seemed like the whole family was in on it. I remember asking my mom, what happened exactly? But her answer was always vague, just enough to keep me hanging on. She'd say, "We'll talk about it later," or "It's complicated." What did that even mean? But, of course, later never came. Everyone was just brushing it off like it was no big deal, but I knew something wasn't right. The arrest itself was just a surface issue. The real story was buried deeper, wrapped in layers of family secrets that no one wanted to bring to light. As the days went by, I couldn't stop thinking about what was actually going on behind closed doors. And then it hit me. It wasn't just my uncle who was facing trouble. It was the entire family. Everyone had something to hide. I started noticing little things. Comments that didn't add up. Strange looks exchanged between relatives when they thought no one was watching. The way my aunt avoided my eyes when I asked her for details. Something was definitely being hidden, and I was determined to figure out exactly what it was. But the more I dug, the more I realized how deep the web of deception went. It wasn't just about what my uncle had done. It was about what the family was trying to cover up. No one was willing to speak the truth, and everyone was so caught up in protecting each other that the real reason for the arrest was being buried under a mountain of lies. What was the truth? And why wasn't anyone brave enough to say it? When the arrest happened, it wasn't just a scandal for my uncle. It sent shockwaves through the entire family. The aftermath was like an emotional hurricane. tearing apart the usual calm and cohesion we'd always known. And honestly, it felt like everyone was in survival mode, just trying to keep the facade intact. I could feel the tension in the air whenever we gathered, like an invisible cloud of guilt and anxiety that none of us could escape. The strangest thing was how each family member reacted differently, but at the same time, there was this unspoken understanding that no one was going to talk about the real reason behind the arrest. Take my dad, for example. He's usually the calm, collected type, the one who can navigate any situation without raising an eyebrow. But after the arrest, he was different. I'd catch him staring into space, lost in thought, like his mind was a million miles away. I remember one night, he and I were sitting in the kitchen, and I asked him flat out what had happened. His response was cryptic, to say the least. "You'll understand when you're older," he said. What did that even mean? The more I tried to push for answers, the more he clammed up. It was as if he was actively trying to protect me, but also keeping me at arm's length. And yet, I knew deep down that he knew more than he was letting on. My mom, on the other hand, was in a state of denial. She kept repeating the same phrases over and over. "It'll all blow over. It's just a misunderstanding, he'll be fine." But every time she said those things, her eyes would dart away, avoiding mine like she was trying to avoid some uncomfortable truth. She'd get this nervous laugh, like she was trying to convince herself that it wasn't a big deal. But it was a big deal, and I could see through her act. Deep inside, she was scared, terrified that this scandal could destroy everything we had worked so hard to build. It wasn't just about my uncle anymore. It was about the family's reputation, and she would do anything to protect that. Then there was my aunt, who had always been the family's rock, the one everyone leaned on in times of trouble. She was the voice of reason, the one who could always be counted on for support. But now she was avoiding my gaze like the plague. Every time I tried to ask her about my uncle's arrest, she'd change the subject or make some vague comment. It was so obvious that something was off, and yet she'd shut me down every single time. Could tell she was hurting too, but there was this wall between us that hadn't been there before. The truth was, my aunt had a lot to lose if the real reason for the arrest came out. She wasn't just protecting my uncle, she was protecting the family as a whole, even if it meant keeping the truth buried. And then there was my cousin who, if I'm being honest, was always the black sheep of the family. The one who was always a little too reckless, a little too impulsive, and often found himself tangled up in messes that no one else could get out of. But this time he was eerily quiet. He'd always been the one to speak his mind no matter what, but when it came to this, he was completely shut off. I overheard him talking to my mom one night. His voice barely above a whisper, as if he was afraid someone else might hear. I couldn't make out all the words, but I caught something that made my stomach drop. "We can't let the truth get out. It's bigger than all of us." It was then that I realized the extent of the cover-up. This wasn't just about my uncle, it was about protecting a whole lot of people, including some who had everything to lose if the hidden truth came to light. My family wasn't just hiding a mistake. They were hiding a deeper, more dangerous secret, one that, if uncovered, could unravel everything. And I was stuck in the middle, trying to make sense of a situation that no one was willing to explain. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this family drama was far more complex than I had ever imagined. The layers of deception went deep, and the longer I stayed quiet, the harder it was going to be to pull back the curtain on what really happened. But the real question was, why? Why were they all so desperate to protect the secret? It was like this unspoken rule that you just didn't ask about the truth, no matter how much you wanted to. Was it out of love, fear, or was it simply a matter of survival, a way to keep everything from falling apart? I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something seriously wrong here, something that, if revealed, would change everything I thought I knew about my family. What had I really gotten myself into by asking questions? Was I ready to uncover the hidden truth? At first, I thought maybe I was just overthinking things. I mean, it was my uncle, right? The same guy who had always been the life of the party, the one who would always show up with a ridiculous story or some crazy adventure he'd been on. He wasn't the type of person I imagined being in serious trouble. But as time went on, I couldn't shake this nagging feeling that there was more to the story, something no one was telling me. I wasn't the type to sit around waiting for the truth to be handed to me, especially when it felt like everyone else had a piece of the puzzle and just wasn't letting me in on it. So I decided to dig deeper. It started with small things, those odd little details that didn't add up. I noticed that certain family members were acting strangely, and others were completely absent from the conversation. My mom, as much as she tried to hide it, would sometimes slip up, giving me small hints that there was more going on than I knew. For example, one afternoon when I was asking her about the charges against my uncle, she was quick to change the subject, but not before she muttered something under her breath. "It's not what it seems." Those words stuck with me. They were so casual, almost like she was brushing off something huge, but at the same time they were loaded with meaning. What did she mean by that? What wasn't it? I started to pay closer attention to everything around me. Conversations I overheard in the kitchen, phone calls I wasn't meant to hear, and the way my family would try to shield certain things from me. It was like they thought I wouldn't notice, but I did. The clues were scattered everywhere. One day, I stumbled across an old family photo album tucked away in my aunt's study. It was strange that I'd never seen this particular album before. My aunt had always been proud of her collection, and she usually kept it out for everyone to see. But this one was hidden, locked away. Naturally, I pulled it down from the shelf and started flipping through the pages. That's when I saw it. A picture of my uncle, standing next to someone I didn't recognize. He looked younger, probably in his 20s, and there was an air of secrecy around him, like he was involved in something no one wanted to admit. But the biggest shock came when I saw the date written on the back of the photo. The same year my uncle had supposedly been on a business trip. My curiosity went into overdrive. What was he involved in back then? I couldn't ignore the gut feeling that something shady was going on, so I began connecting the dots. Slowly but surely, I started piecing together the hidden truth, pulling together the stories that didn't quite match up, the subtle hints from relatives, and the little gaps in the narrative. My uncle wasn't just arrested for a minor misunderstanding or a bad decision. There was something much darker at play. The truth was becoming clearer, but it wasn't something I was prepared for. I decided to confront my cousin, who had always been a little more open with me than the others. After a few awkward conversations, I finally got him alone, and that's when he let something slip. He mentioned the debt, and just as quickly as the words left his mouth, he shut down, realizing what he'd just revealed. My heart raced. Debt? What kind of debt? And why was my uncle mixed up in something like that? He wouldn't say more, but that was enough to send me spiraling. I started digging into the kind of debt he might have been talking about. Real estate dealings, shady loans, gambling. And why had no one told me? Over the next few weeks, the pieces started falling into place. My uncle had gotten involved with the wrong people a long time ago. People who dealt with money under the table, shady investments that promised high returns but carried heavy risks. His arrest wasn't just about breaking the law. It was about betrayal, hidden alliances, and debts that he could never repay. And what made it worse was the fact that my family knew all along but chose to protect him, to cover up the ugly truth instead of dealing with it head-on. They'd let him spiral deeper into this web of lies, and now it had come back to bite all of us. The realization hit me hard. They hadn't just been protecting him, they'd been protecting themselves too. Now, I couldn't help but wonder, how many of my family members had been complicit in this? How far had they gone to keep the truth hidden? And most importantly, why? Was it loyalty, fear, or something else entirely? By the time I had uncovered the layers of deception surrounding my uncle's arrest, I was left with a feeling of pure disbelief. It wasn't just the arrest itself, it was everything that led up to it and everything that came with it. The scandal wasn't just about one person making a mistake. It was about the entire family being complicit in hiding the truth, and the web of lies we'd been wrapped up in. It was like watching a slow-motion train wreck and realizing you'd been standing right there, unable to stop it. There were so many pieces to the puzzle, so many truths that had been buried, and I couldn't escape the feeling that the foundation of everything I thought I knew about my family had been built on lies. The worst part. It wasn't just the fact that my uncle had gotten himself into trouble. It was that no one had told me the truth from the start. The family had kept up this elaborate cover-up, hiding his debts, his shady connections, and the real reasons behind his arrest. I can't even count how many times I had been told, "It's not as bad as it looks," or "We'll figure it out, don't worry." The more they said that, the more I realized they were just covering up something much darker than any of us could have imagined. They were protecting themselves, protecting their image, their reputation, at the cost of my uncle's freedom, and eventually the family's sanity. When I finally pieced everything together, the weight of the truth felt like it was crushing me. This wasn't just a family drama. It was betrayal at the deepest level. My uncle wasn't the only one who had failed us. It was everyone who had hidden the truth from me, who had kept me in the dark while pretending everything was fine. It wasn't just his arrest that had caused this turmoil. It was the way the family had failed to be honest with each other. They had allowed this secret to fester for years, sweeping it under the rug until it could no longer be ignored. And the worst part, I was left to deal with the fallout, left to navigate a sea of broken trust and shattered relationships. My aunt had always been the person I turned to when I needed guidance. She was the glue that held our family together, always offering sound advice and showing up when things got tough. But after everything came to light, I realized she had known all along. She was part of the cover-up, and worse, she'd actively participated in keeping the truth from me. She was protecting my uncle, sure, but she was also protecting herself. When I confronted her, she couldn't even look me in the eye. I could tell she was struggling with guilt, but it didn't make it any easier. I felt betrayed by someone I had always trusted, someone who had been a mother figure to me. The emotional weight of that was hard to bear. And then there was my cousin, who had always been a little more reckless than the rest of us. I had caught him talking to my mom on the phone one night, but he wasn't being discreet enough. I overheard him say, "We can't let the truth come out. It's going to destroy everything." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. That was when it finally clicked. This wasn't just about my uncle anymore. It was about saving face. It was about the family doing everything in their power to protect themselves from the consequences of their actions. They had allowed this mess to grow, to become something much worse, all because they were too afraid to face the truth. The deeper I dug, the more I realized how much my family was willing to sacrifice to keep their secrets intact. It wasn't just about protecting my uncle. It was about protecting their own image, their reputation, and their comfort. They had let their loyalty to each other cloud their judgment and had sacrificed honesty for the sake of keeping everything together. But in doing so, they had set the stage for a much bigger disaster. And that's when I realized that the betrayal wasn't just about my uncle. It was about my entire family. The truth, as painful as it was, had to come out. There was no avoiding it anymore. The only question was, how would we all cope with the fallout once the truth was fully unveiled? The truth about my uncle's arrest hit harder than I ever imagined, but as the weeks passed and the legal trouble began to unravel, I realized this wasn't just a personal scandal. It was a full-blown catastrophe for the entire family. The consequences of his actions, and more importantly, the lies we'd all been complicit in, were starting to take shape. What had once seemed like a minor family issue quickly spiraled into something bigger, something that threatened not just my uncle's future, but the fabric of everything we had worked so hard to build as a family. And there was no denying it. The legal ramifications were massive. We were in over our heads, and there was no going back. The first wake-up call came when I saw my uncle in handcuffs, escorted to a police car, with the weight of the world on his shoulders. It wasn't the image of the carefree, funny man I had known my whole life. It was the image of someone who had made a series of poor choices that had finally caught up with him. The criminal charges against him were serious. He was facing everything from fraud to conspiracy, and, worst of all, the possibility of a long prison sentence. But as terrible as that was, it wasn't just his future that was at stake. The legal trouble was now our trouble. The whole family was being pulled into the mess, and there was no way out. The more I learned about the details of the case, the more I realized how deep the hole we were in truly was. I remember sitting in the lawyer's office with my parents and my aunt. It was one of the first times I had seen everyone together since the arrest, and it felt like we were all walking through a fog, uncertain of what was to come. The lawyer, who had been hired to help my uncle, was brutally honest with us. "This isn't going to be easy," he said, his voice serious but measured. "There's a lot of evidence against him. It's going to take everything we have to fight this, and even then, the chances of him getting a reduced sentence are slim." My stomach dropped when I heard those words. This wasn't just some mistake or misunderstanding. It was a full-blown criminal case that would take years to resolve. And even then, we weren't guaranteed a happy ending. The worst part was knowing that my uncle had been involved in this for much longer than I had realized. The charges against him were tied to a series of shady business dealings, financial schemes that had gone wrong, and people who didn't care about the damage they caused along the way. It was so much bigger than any of us had anticipated. This wasn't just a simple case of bad judgment. It was a criminal conspiracy that involved multiple people, some of whom were still out there, untouchable. And my uncle. He had been swept up in it all, caught in a situation where there was no way out. As the legal proceedings moved forward, the emotional toll on the family became unbearable. There was constant tension, this looming sense of dread hanging over every family gathering. No one knew how to deal with it. My dad, who had always been the one to handle things with calm efficiency, was losing his composure. He'd been quiet, withdrawn, staring at his phone for hours, researching the case and trying to figure out what we could do to help my uncle. But it was clear, the more we researched, the worse it seemed to get. Each new piece of information only dug us deeper into a hole we couldn't get out of. Then there was the financial strain. The lawyer's fees alone were enough to drain our savings, and that wasn't even considering the potential costs of a trial. My mom started quietly looking into second jobs, and my aunt was making calls to see if she could sell some of her investments to cover the legal expenses. It wasn't just the shame of it all, it was the fact that, as a family, we were about to lose everything we'd worked for. The legal trouble was now a full-blown financial crisis, and it felt like we were being dragged down into a pit with no way of climbing out. But the emotional consequences, they were even worse. As much as we tried to rally around my uncle, it was impossible to ignore the fractures that were forming in our family. The trust that had been built over the years started to crumble. Family loyalty. It was put to the test in ways I never could have imagined. Everyone started pointing fingers, some blaming my uncle, others blaming each other for not seeing the warning signs earlier. It wasn't just about saving face anymore. It was about trying to hold on to whatever semblance of normalcy we could. But the more we tried to hold it together, the more the cracks appeared. It wasn't just the financial strain, it was the emotional conflict, the guilt, and the fear of what might happen next. Every day brought a new twist in the case. There were meetings with the lawyer, phone calls from law enforcement, and more news reports covering the scandal. The whole town was talking about it. And the longer it went on, the more the reputation of our family began to deteriorate. We weren't just dealing with criminal charges. We were dealing with the fallout of a family secret that had been buried for years. It was like watching a slow-motion train wreck with no way to stop it. The truth was coming out, and there was no way to prevent it from destroying everything. At that point, it was clear that no one in the family was unaffected by the legal trouble. The emotional toll, the fear, and the guilt had everyone walking on eggshells, unsure of what was coming next. And as we waited for the next court date, I couldn't help but think about the bigger picture. What was going to happen to us once the full truth was out in the open? Would we survive this scandal, or would it tear us apart forever? It wasn't long before I realized that keeping the truth buried wasn't going to solve anything. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my family was a ticking time bomb, waiting for the moment when everything would blow up in our faces. I'd spent so much time trying to piece together the hidden truth, but now it was time to confront my family directly. No more beating around the bush. No more vague answers and hushed conversations. I needed to hear it from them, straight to my face. It was time to stop pretending like everything was fine and finally get to the heart of what had been going on for so long. I knew this wasn't going to be easy. Confrontation never is. But at this point I was done with all the guessing and silence. I was done with the emotional turmoil of not knowing what was happening behind closed doors. And to be honest, I was tired of feeling like I was the only one who didn't have the full picture. My mind was racing with questions, and I couldn't rest until I got some answers. The family was fractured already. All the lies, the cover-ups, and the guilt had built up to a point where I could feel the weight of it in every room we gathered in. So I made up my mind. I was going to confront my mom, my aunt, and my dad, and I wasn't going to let them off the hook until they told me the whole truth. It all came to a head one night when we all sat down for dinner. My mom was acting like she usually did, trying to keep the peace, making small talk about how stressful everything had been. But I could see it in her eyes. The guilt, the fear, the weight of the lie she had been carrying. My aunt was quieter than usual, her hands folded neatly on her lap, avoiding eye contact whenever I tried to engage her. And my dad, well, he was just flat out nervous, which was rare for him. He kept glancing at his phone as if he was waiting for some new development in the case, but the tension in the air was palpable. It wasn't just the case that was eating away at him. It was everything else too. The secrecy, the unspoken truths, the fact that we were all in this mess together, and no one was acknowledging the elephant in the room. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed my hands on the table, the sound echoing through the quiet room. It caught everyone off guard, and the conversation stopped dead. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Why the hell are we pretending like everything's normal? I asked, my voice cracking with a mixture of frustration and desperation. What's really going on here? Why are we still keeping all this hidden? My mom looked like she was about to say something, but then stopped herself. Her face turned pale, and for a moment, I saw the weight of it all in her eyes. She wasn't ready for this, but I couldn't wait any longer. I needed the truth, and I needed it now. That's enough, my aunt said, her voice shaking. You don't understand what's at stake here. Her words were clipped, defensive, like she was trying to protect something or someone. It was clear she wasn't prepared for this confrontation, but she knew it was inevitable. I felt the anger bubbling up inside me, a mix of betrayal, confusion, and hurt. No, I don't understand. Please explain it to me. Explain why you've been keeping this from me. Explain why I've been the last to know everything. Because at this point, it's like I'm the outsider in my own family, and I'm done with it. I deserve to know what's been going on. The room fell silent. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. I could feel the emotional conflict swirling around us. Everyone in that room was struggling with something. Guilt, shame, fear, or maybe all of it. But no one spoke for what felt like hours. It wasn't that they didn't know the truth. It was that they didn't know how to say it out loud. How could they? How could they admit to the lies they'd been telling for so long? How could they confess to protecting someone at the expense of their own family's peace of mind? Then my dad finally spoke, his voice low but steady. We didn't want to burden you, he said. We didn't want you to be a part of this mess. Your uncle, he hesitated, searching for the right words. He's in deep, and we didn't want you to get caught in the crossfire. But we should have told you sooner. We should have trusted you with the truth. Those words hit me harder than I was ready for. My dad, the one who always seemed to have everything under control, the one who was supposed to protect us from the storm, had been keeping the most dangerous secret of all. And the worst part, he'd done it out of love, out of a misguided sense of wanting to protect me. But in the end, he had shielded me from the one thing I needed most, trust. I felt this mix of anger and heartbreak wash over me. I wanted to scream, to cry, to throw something, but I didn't. Instead, I sat there, letting the weight of his words sink in. The truth was out. The moment I had been waiting for had finally come, and now I had to process it all. But the truth wasn't the end of it. No, this was just the beginning of a much deeper conversation. One about forgiveness, family loyalty, and what it meant to move forward. From all the deception, I could already feel the emotional strain of it all, and it wasn't going to be easy to heal from the scars this moment would leave. But one thing was clear now. We couldn't keep pretending anymore. The truth was out, and we had no choice but to face the consequences. The question now was, what would we do with it? Could we rebuild what had been broken? Could we survive the emotional fallout of all the secrets that had been kept from me for so long? The guilt and shame that washed over my family after everything came to light were suffocating. It was as if the very air we breathed had changed. The weight of the secret that had been buried for so long was finally lifting, but instead of relief, it felt like we were being crushed by the aftermath. The emotional impact was far worse than I ever imagined, and it wasn't just about my uncle. It was about everyone involved, the people who had helped cover it up, who had hidden the truth in the name of family loyalty, and the ones who had stayed silent, hoping it would all blow over. We were all complicit in one way or another, and now there was no escaping the consequences. My mom, who had always been the rock of the family, was the first one to break. I could see it in her eyes, the deep regret, the sadness. She'd always been the one to tell me to do the right thing, to be honest, and to never let secrets fester. But here she was, sitting at the kitchen table, tears silently streaming down her face, weighed down by the burden of her own choices. "I should have told you sooner," she said, her voice trembling. "I should have trusted you with the truth. But I thought I was protecting you. I thought I was doing what was best for you, for all of us." It broke my heart to hear her say that. I wanted to tell her that I understood, that I knew she had made these choices out of love, but I couldn't. The truth was, I was angry. Angry at the lies, angry at the secrecy, and angry at how her decisions had kept me in the dark for so long. I wanted to forgive her, but at that moment, forgiveness felt impossible. The betrayal was too fresh, the wounds too deep. And my aunt, she was a different story. She had always been the glue that held our family together, the one we turned to when things got tough. But when everything came out, I saw her in a completely new light. She was struggling with guilt in a way that was almost suffocating. She was always trying to fix things, always offering support, but now I could see the cracks in her facade. She had played a role in the cover-up, and the weight of that was too much for her to bear. Every time I tried to talk to her, she would look away, her hands shaking, as if she couldn't face the truth of what she had been involved in. She had thought she was protecting my uncle, but in reality she was protecting herself. Her own reputation, her own sense of control. And now, she was left with the fallout, the shame of knowing that her actions had contributed to the unraveling of everything. My dad, too, was drowning in guilt. He had always prided himself on being the one who kept everything under control, the one who could fix any problem. But now, sitting there in the midst of this mess, I could see how deeply his choices had affected him. He had kept me in the dark because he wanted to protect me, but in doing so, he had caused a rift in the family that might never heal. Every day I would catch him staring off into space, lost in thought, as if trying to figure out how to make things right. But there was no simple solution. The damage had been done. The truth had come out, and there was no going back. His guilt was written all over his face, and it was almost like he didn't know how to look at me without feeling like he had failed me. And then there was my cousin, who, despite his usual bravado, was now visibly struggling with the guilt of his own actions. He had been one of the ones to help cover up the truth, but now he was avoiding everyone. Every time I tried to reach out to him, he would shut me out, retreating into his own world, unable to face the mess we were all in. I could tell that he felt the weight of his decisions, and though he never said it out loud, I knew he was wrestling with feelings of regret and shame. He had helped protect my uncle, but at what cost? The bonds between us had been stretched so thin, and the guilt from the lies we had all told hung in the air like a dark cloud. What struck me the most, though, was the silence that permeated our home. The air was thick with unspoken words, with emotions that no one knew how to express. Guilt and shame don't just go away. They linger, they eat away at you, and they make it hard to look the people you love in the eye. We had all been so focused on protecting each other from the truth that we had forgotten what it meant to be honest with ourselves. Now the damage was done, and we had to live with the consequences. But as much as I hated to admit it, I knew that we couldn't move forward without facing the guilt head-on. It was the only way we could begin to heal. I realized, though, that this wasn't just about my family's guilt. It was about me too. I had spent so much time trying to uncover the truth, trying to piece together the story, but now I was realizing that I, too, had been complicit in my own way. I had turned a blind eye to the little things, the small hints that something wasn't right. I had let the lies go on, thinking it was easier to ignore them than to confront the discomfort. But now the guilt was on me too. I had been part of this mess, and as much as I wanted to blame my family for their choices, I couldn't escape the fact that I had chosen to stay quiet as well. Guilt wasn't just an emotion, it was a shared experience, something that ran through all of us, binding us together in ways we weren't ready to face. But here's the thing. Guilt doesn't just stay with you, it pushes you to change, to grow, to make things right. And I knew in that moment that the only way out of this mess was through it. We had to face the shame, the guilt, the pain, and we had to do it together. If we didn't, we would never heal. We would be stuck in this cycle of regret forever. And I refused to let that happen. As the days went by, it became increasingly clear that the guilt and shame we were all carrying weren't going to disappear overnight. No matter how much we wished things could just go back to normal, there was no quick fix for what we had been through. The truth was out, the damage had been done, and now we were left with the aftermath, left to deal with the fallout of our own actions, the consequences of hiding the truth for so long. But as heavy as the burden felt, I also knew that there was only one way forward. Forgiveness. Forgiveness, I quickly realized, wasn't just about letting go of the past. It wasn't about forgetting the mistakes, the lies, or the betrayal. It was about accepting that we had all made choices, some of them good, some of them bad, and understanding that we were all human. We were all flawed, and we had to accept that if we were ever going to heal. I knew I had to forgive my family, but even more importantly, I had to forgive myself. That was the hardest part. I had spent so much time being angry, being hurt, and feeling betrayed that I had lost sight of the fact that I, too, had been part of the problem. I had been part of the silence, part of the cover-up. And it was only when I acknowledged that I could start the process of healing. It wasn't easy, though. Forgiving someone who had lied to you for so long, who had kept such a huge secret from you, felt almost impossible. But I knew deep down that forgiveness wasn't just for the other person. It was for me. Holding on to anger, resentment, and the weight of the past would only continue to hurt me, and I had to let go of that pain if I ever wanted to move on. But forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean pretending like everything was fine. It meant accepting that we all made mistakes, and that we could rebuild if we were willing to face the truth head-on. One of the first steps toward healing was having the difficult conversations. I sat down with my mom, my aunt, and my dad, each of us looking at the mess we had created. The conversation was raw, emotional, and, at times, uncomfortable. But it was necessary. We needed to talk about what had happened, about how the lies had affected us, and about the ways we could move forward as a family. And for the first time in what felt like forever, we were all honest with each other. There was no more hiding, no more pretending. We were all on the same page, acknowledging the mistakes, the betrayal, and the hurt that had been caused. And in that honesty, we began to find a way to rebuild what had been broken. It wasn't just about talking, it was about actions too. We had to prove that we could change, that we could do better. And that started with making amends. My uncle, facing his criminal charges, was going to have to deal with the consequences of his actions, but the rest of us had to figure out how we could make things right on our end. That meant offering support, not just financial support, which was part of it, but emotional support too. It meant being there for each other, even when things were tough, and showing up in ways that we hadn't done before. For me, personally, it meant letting go of the anger I had held onto for so long. It meant understanding that my uncle's actions weren't a reflection of who I was, or who the rest of the family was. He had made his choices, but that didn't have to define me. The same went for my mom, my aunt, and my dad. We all had our flaws, but that didn't mean we couldn't change, that we couldn't start over. It took time, but slowly the healing began. It started with small steps, being kind to one another, showing empathy, and allowing space for vulnerability. But as much as we wanted to heal, we knew it wasn't going to happen overnight. Healing takes time, it's not a linear process, and there would be setbacks along the way. There would be moments when the old wounds would resurface, when the guilt and shame would come crashing back. But we had to keep moving forward step by step. The important thing was that we were willing to try, that we were committed to rebuilding our relationships, even if it meant facing the uncomfortable truths along the way. For me, one of the hardest parts of moving forward was learning to trust again. How could I trust my family after everything they had kept from me? How could I trust them after the lies and betrayal? But as time went on, I realized that trust, like forgiveness, is earned. It's not something that just happens. It's something you have to work at. Slowly, I started to rebuild my trust in them, just as they were working to rebuild their trust in me. It wasn't easy, but I knew it was worth it. In the end, moving forward wasn't just about forgiving the past. It was about creating a future where we could be honest with each other, where we could support each other without fear of betrayal. It was about acknowledging our mistakes, owning up to them, and doing the work to make sure we didn't repeat them. And while I knew the scars from the scandal would never completely fade, I also knew that I was stronger because of it. My family was stronger because of it. We had weathered the storm together, and now we were learning how to rebuild, one piece at a time. Looking back on everything that's happened, there's no doubt in my mind that this entire ordeal has been one of the most challenging experiences of my life. But as much as I wish I could forget the pain, the lies, and the broken trust, I've come to realize that there are lessons embedded in all of this. It's taken time, a lot of reflection, and honestly a lot of internal struggle, but I've learned so much about myself, my family, and what really matters when it comes to facing the hardest truths. The first lesson, and probably the most painful, is that no matter how close you are to someone, no one is perfect. We all make mistakes, some big, some small. We all have our flaws, our weaknesses, and sometimes we make choices that are hard to come back from. But what really matters is how we respond to those mistakes. It's not the mistake itself that defines us. It's how we own up to it and how we handle the consequences. My uncle's arrest, the lies, and the cover-up. It was a massive wake-up call that nobody is immune to falling from grace. And yet, it's the way you choose to rebuild from that fall that shapes your character. Another lesson I learned, perhaps the hardest one to swallow, is the importance of honesty. Not just the kind of honesty that's easy, the kind where everything's going well and you're just telling the truth because there's nothing to hide. No, the kind of honesty that really matters is the tough kind. The kind that forces you to face uncomfortable truths, the kind that forces you to be vulnerable, even when it hurts. Throughout all of this, I realized that the only way we can truly heal as a family, or as individuals, is by being brutally honest with ourselves and each other. The more we buried the truth, the more it ate away at us. The more we avoided it, the harder it became to face. But the moment we started being honest, everything began to shift. We were able to rebuild, not on a foundation of lies, but on a foundation of truth. And that truth was painful, but it was also liberating. One thing I learned through all of this was the importance of forgiveness. At first, I didn't want to forgive anyone. Not my uncle, not my family, and certainly not myself. The anger and betrayal felt too raw, too fresh. But as time went on, I realized that forgiveness wasn't about excusing anyone's behavior. It wasn't about saying that everything that happened was okay. It was about letting go of the weight of the past, about freeing myself from the shackles of anger and resentment. Forgiveness is not a gift you give to the other person. It's a gift you give to yourself. By forgiving, I was able to release the burden of bitterness and find a way to move forward. It didn't happen overnight, but as I began to understand the complexity of my family's actions, I was able to release the anger and start to heal. I forgave because I didn't want to carry that heavy load anymore. Trust, this one has been the hardest for me. After everything, how do you learn to trust again? How do you let your guard down when you've been hurt so deeply? At first, I wasn't sure I could ever trust my family again. The lies they told, the things they kept hidden from me, it felt like a betrayal of the worst kind. But as time went on, I realized that trust is something that's built over time, piece by piece. It's not something that can be rushed or forced. It's earned through consistency, through actions, through honesty. And while rebuilding that trust was a long road, I've come to understand that trust can be restored if both sides are committed to it. I learned that trust isn't a one-time thing. It's something that has to be nurtured and cared for. And even though I still carry the scars of what happened, I know that trust can come back if I'm willing to let go of my fear and open up again. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, I learned that family isn't about perfection. It's not about getting everything right or always making the best choices. Family is about being there for each other even when things go wrong. It's about standing together in the face of adversity, about showing up when it's hard, and about sticking together even when the truth is messy. My family, despite everything, has come out of this stronger. We've learned how to communicate better, how to forgive, and how to be honest with one another. We're not perfect, but we've learned to be a little bit more honest, a little bit more open, and a lot more understanding. And in the end, that's what family is about, being there for each other no matter what. As hard as it's been, as painful as this whole experience has been, I know that I'm stronger for it. I'm wiser. And, perhaps most importantly, I'm more open to the idea of growth. Growth in myself, in my relationships, and in my understanding of what truly matters. The truth may have torn us apart for a while, but it has also brought us closer. We've learned, we've grown, and we've found a way to move forward. And no matter what happens next, I know that we'll continue to grow, continue to heal, and continue to build something stronger than what we had before. At this point, I've shared everything. The highs, the lows, the moments of clarity, and the moments of pure chaos. But now I want to hear from you. What do you think about this entire situation? How would you have handled things if you were in my shoes? Have you ever experienced something similar where secrets tore your family apart, and you had to find a way to put the pieces back together? I want to know how you would have reacted, whether you would have confronted your family the same way I did, or if you would have gone down a completely different path. I know that some of you might be dealing with your own family struggles, your own stories of betrayal, guilt, and healing. So, I want to open up the conversation. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to face a family member who hid something from you for a long time? What did it do to your relationship? And how did you work through it? Do you believe that forgiveness is possible? Or are there some things that are just too big to overcome? I'm really curious to know what you think, because this journey we've been through isn't just about me. It's about all of us. We all have our own family stories, our own struggles with trust and truth. And by sharing these experiences, we can learn from each other and grow stronger together. Also, if you've got any questions about my story, anything I didn't cover or things you're still wondering about, feel free to ask. I'll do my best to answer them and provide more context where I can. This is a safe space for all of us to be open and real, so don't hesitate to speak up. Whether it's something you've been thinking about for a while or a question that popped up while watching, I'm here for it. And if you found this video helpful, or if it resonated with you in any way, don't forget to hit that like button. It helps me know that these conversations matter to you, and it encourages me to keep sharing. Also, make sure to subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss out on any future content where we dive into more real, raw, and relatable stories like this one. And if you're comfortable with it, share this video with someone you think might need to hear it. You never know, it might be exactly what they need to hear today. Now that you've heard the whole story, the truth about my uncle's arrest and the consequences it had on my family, I have to ask, what would you do in my shoes? Would you keep the truth buried like everyone else did? Or would you face it head-on? The hardest part of all of this wasn't uncovering the secret. It was deciding how to move forward once the truth was out. And I know it's not easy to rebuild trust, to heal, and to forgive after something like this. But if we don't take those steps, we stay stuck in the past. And trust me, I'm not about to stay stuck. I want to challenge you, whether you've been through something similar or not, to think about your own relationships. Is there something you've been hiding, something you've been avoiding? Maybe it's time to face the truth. Maybe it's time to forgive. And maybe, just maybe, it's time to heal no matter how messy the process might be. So what do you think? Can you forgive a betrayal like this? Or do some things break relationships beyond repair? Let me know in the comments below. I want to hear your thoughts. And if you're ready to take that first step toward healing, whether it's in your own life or with your family, don't wait too long. Life's too short to carry that weight forever. If this video helped you think about forgiveness, family, or trust in a new way, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, and come back for more stories that are real, raw, and meant to spark change. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next one.